Welcome back, Rebel fans. You're listening to another episode of the Rebel Talk presented by the Rebel Walk. I'm Cam Wicker, and as always, I'm here with Zach Moreth. And we're here today to talk a little bit about the college football playoff rankings as well as just recruiting in football. Over the past couple of days, been a pretty big time for recruiting for Ole Miss football since that Georgia win. And we'll briefly end with just some recap of basketball recently and what's to come for basketball in the next couple of weeks for as the break rolls on for Ole Miss. Really just starting to jump into it right now. Ole Miss ninth in the playoff rankings just came out about 20 minutes ago now. I'm gonna be honest with you, Zach. I was pretty surprised to see Ole Miss ahead of Georgia. You would think they put Ole Miss ahead of Georgia in these rankings, considering the matchup that happened about a week ago, and Ole Miss really just put on a dominant performance in that game, showed that they can beat those powerhouse teams like Georgia. But there was just that feeling as an Ole Miss fan, I guess you would say, that Georgia was going to be ahead of Ole Miss in these rankings. But then you look at the rankings, you see Georgia come in at 10, so you know Ole Miss is ahead of them. Obviously, they put Ole Miss at 9. And this is where I think the controversy comes into play. Miami ahead of Ole Miss at 8, and Notre Dame is at 6 ahead of Alabama. And I believe I heard these people talking about it on the broadcast before the rankings coming out, and they were comparing Indiana and Notre Dame and stuff like that. This is a Notre Dame team that's not going to play a conference championship. This is a Notre Dame team that really hasn't played a lot of tough teams outside of Texas A&M. So what do you do with a team like Notre Dame? And better yet, what do you do with a team like Indiana if they lose this game this coming weekend against Ohio State?
Yeah, and I want to start with Indiana, Cam. A couple Indiana fans are slandering me on Twitter. Look, we talked about it last week. They have probably the worst schedule out of all these teams, in terms of opponents that they play. It's really nobody until this weekend. They play Ohio State. Now, the thing for me is I was asking some of my buddies. So let's say, if Indiana loses by more than 2 scores, quite honestly, I think they're done. You saw it happen to BYU. I think they dropped them 8 spots.
And I believe they're a 14-point underdog going into this game as well.
Yeah, right. So I mean, if you lose by those 2 scores like you're supposed to Ohio State, I think you're out. And the question comes in is if you lose by, let's say, a game-winning field goal, or if you win, right? Because that's really going to shake things up. Because myself included, I'm not expecting Indiana to be in this 12-team playoff after this week. And if they do, it's going to make things confusing. It's going to keep teams like Tennessee fully out, which I know a lot of Rebel fans might enjoy. But, we got to see what's going on. And then you look at Notre Dame, they're going to play a really competitive Army team. I know they smoked Navy a couple weeks ago, but I do think Army is the better out of those two. They got a lot of momentum coming into this game. You'd love to see an upset there. And then Notre Dame has to play a rivalry game in Southern California against USC. Rivalry weekend, that last weekend of the year, you don't know what's going to happen. So it's important to understand that Notre Dame still has 2 really big games to play. But it's very comparable to Indiana. I do think it's frustrating that with the schedules that they have, we're looking at this bracket, looking at 2 teams that are going to host a playoff game right now. But I want to go back to what you started with here. I was shocked when Georgia came up before Ole Miss. I was telling my buddies, similar to what Cam said, I don't agree with the committee putting Georgia above Ole Miss, but I think they're going to, and they didn't. So that was a really nice surprise, man. I was having dinner with, Ole Miss legendary journalist Jeff Robertson. We were fired up. And then here you go. You look at the bracket and your first trip is projected to go to Bloomington. Yes, please. Being from Chicago, it's a 4-hour drive there. I would happily be there. And I quite honestly, I think we would handle Indiana with no problems at all. Again, they play Ohio State. We're going to figure out a lot more after this weekend. And as for Ole Miss, the message remains the same. There's no margin for error. Your backs are against the wall, and the team in Gainesville is going to try and do everything they can to spoil that and spoil this entire season. So you really have to go ready, win that one, and then close out on a high note with the Egg Bowl. But just looking at this bracket right now, Cam, I just want to get your overall thoughts. Texas still has to play A&M. There's a lot of question marks. But just how do you see this playing out?
I guess the big thing for me that stood out in this bracket that they had projected onto the screen after the playoff rankings was really Boise State at that 4 spot. This is the time that we expected kind of maybe to see this eventually with the fall off of Miami and the fall off of the Big 12 as a whole at late in this season. BYU still hanging in there at the 12 spot, but it's hard to believe you put a Boise State team at the 4 spot, giving them that bye. And I think it's something that the committee is going to have to look at in the future. It's something that the conference champions maybe don't need to hold so much weight depending on the conference that you're in. And I believe I heard some of these people talking about like Greg McElroy mentioned mentioned the Lane Kiffin quote from earlier this week talking about really you don't want to maybe not have to play in that SEC championship game. And I agree with Kiffin to a certain extent there. You don't want to have to go to that matchup and have the risk of not making it if you lose. And because I mean the reward of winning and getting that bye and just for sure getting in is a big reward, but the risk of not getting in is even bigger. But Greg McElroy came to the point where he doesn't think that would happen. He thinks the committee takes that into account, that the strength of schedule at some point, and I believe the committee took that into account today with putting Ole Miss over Georgia. But it's still left in the question if the committee. If you see 10-2 teams in this SEC championship game, which is very likely at this point, especially if Texas A&M goes in here and beats Texas at the end of the year, there's going to be 2 teams in the SEC championship with 2 losses. And the question is going to come, are you going to put a 3-loss Bama team in? Are you going to put a 3-loss Ole Miss team in? Are you going to put a 3-loss Georgia team in? Whatever the case is, just because they lost a close game in the SEC championship game, are you going to leave them out? And I think that's the biggest question right now, just because the strength of the conference. I mean, the strength of the Southeastern Conference right now. The main thing is what really right now is the SEC just kind of separates themselves from the rest of the other conference. I think the Big Ten is obviously that second conference right now. But if you look at the Big Ten, you look at Penn State, you look at Indiana, and you don't see 2 teams that maybe in a lot of people's mind aren't worthy of a playoff spot, especially with a loss this week. If Indiana were to lose this week to Ohio State and just what Penn State has done in the past against bigger programs.
Penn State, man, I feel bad saying this, but quite honestly, if you go up against an SEC team like Georgia, Alabama, or Ole Miss, I don't really care if you're the home seed. I think they're going to get sent home really quickly, Cam. And that would be a matchup that I wouldn't be upset about either. I mean, I would be upset in the fact that the game's being played in Pennsylvania, so I probably wouldn't go to it. But other than that, I think Ole Miss matches up well there. I think they match up well against a lot of these teams. If you look at the bracket, which they're projected in, which is fluid, we're taking it with a grain of salt. But I think Ole Miss easily beats Indiana. I do think Ole Miss is better than Texas. And then the options are Penn State, who I just mentioned, Georgia, who we beat, or Miami, who I believe he would smoke. And then you're in the national championship game. So the potential's there. And, as much as we don't like Boise State and BYU, the Big 12 winner, the ACC winner, the G5 team being in there, they have the potential to make the path really easy for a certain SEC team. Whether it's Alabama, Georgia, or Ole Miss is kind of my question. Maybe Tennessee gets back in the mix. But there's going to be a 3, 4, and 12 seed that are very suspect. And whoever ends up with the luck of the draw of playing in that bracket is probably going to go really far in this playoffs. Just because, if you're looking at this, like Alabama currently has a second round matchup against Oregon, and Ohio State has a second round matchup against Boise State. Like, who do you think is going to have? Who's probably going to win those games, right? So a lot of question marks, a lot of questions to be answered. It's going to continue to be this way until the season's over. And it's important for fans to understand that. It's important for fans to, like I mentioned, you have to take this with a grain of salt because this isn't how it's going to finish. There's a lot of games to be played. And the most important thing for Ole Miss is to win in Gainesville and to win against Mississippi State.
Absolutely. That's the biggest thing. Winning in Gainesville this week. John Sanders Jr. just wrote a feature on him yesterday, talked about in his interview on his press conference on Monday, just taking it one game at a time. Kiffin's been telling this team every week that this is playoff time now. Ever since the LSU loss, it's been playoff time for this Ole Miss team. And ever since that second half in Oklahoma, they've treated it like it's been playoffs for the most part, especially on the defensive end. Just looking at this bracket and looking at what's to come these next 2 weeks left to play for the regular season. My biggest thing is my prediction for the end of the year is I think Texas A&M beats Texas. I think Texas A&M beats Texas and the chaos ensues, and we don't know what happens after that. I think if A&M beats Texas, I think you have no choice but to put A&M at
Right.
a lower seed, maybe 11-10 right there. And that obviously helps Ole Miss. If you win out, you jump ahead maybe to that 8 or 9 spot and possibly host a playoff game. Now, this will put Bama probably in the conference championship and probably in that 4th spot if Bama continues to play at the level they're playing right now. They're probably the hottest team in college football. If not, you're talking about Ole Miss or Oregon in that category as well. But if you're Ole Miss, like Zach says, you're trying to win these next 2 games. And with the position that you're in right now, sitting at the 10 spot, if Indiana goes in here and gets blown out this week at Ohio State, I mean, if Indiana versus Ohio State, it's hard to believe that Indiana stays in this college football playoff bracket, and that's only good news for Ole Miss moving up in this bracket. And I mean, like Zach mentioned earlier, Notre Dame has to play Army this coming up week. We know what they did against Navy a couple weeks ago. They put a little hurting on Navy, but this Army team has been better than Navy in the past, and they've been able to move the ball better on the offensive end. Army has, and that's a game for Notre Dame that could possibly be an upset and push them out of the playoffs, and then also ending the year with USC. But I think at some point, and I spoke about this with someone today, at some point with Notre Dame, if there's a spot where Notre Dame, if other teams are better than Notre Dame in the committee's eyes, you have to take into account the loss to NIU. NIU has not been good the remainder of this season, and it's a loss that I believe looms a lot larger on Notre Dame than the Kentucky loss looms on Ole Miss. Obviously, Kentucky hasn't performed well since the Ole Miss win, and hasn't really performed well since those weeks playing Ole Miss in Georgia. Their only SEC win is against Ole Miss. But if you match up Kentucky against NIU, or if you match up Kentucky against Notre Dame, I think Kentucky comes out victorious in both those games. So at some point, I think the committee is going to have to take into account that Notre Dame might not be built for the college football playoffs.
Yeah, I hope we play Notre Dame. Like, that's where I'm at with this, Cam. But the last thing I want to touch on here for all the lovely Tennessee fans out there. These resumes of Tennessee and Ole Miss are not comparable. And yeah, okay, Ole Miss lost to Tennessee. That's kind of the only argument they have. You were in a 3-point game. You were in a 3-point game with Kentucky. Did I say Ole Miss lost to Tennessee? I meant to say Kentucky. Tennessee was in a 3-point game with Kentucky with 4 minutes and 55 seconds left on the clock, Cam. And they're sitting here, yapping away that we lost to Kentucky. And then you compare our head-to-head matchups. Tennessee lost to Arkansas at home. Tennessee lost to Arkansas at Arkansas. We went to Arkansas and beat them by 30. Georgia
just beat them by 10.
Georgia just beat them by 2 possessions. We beat Georgia by 3 possessions. It's not comparable. And then South Carolina's doing their thing, right? I mean, the wins for Ole Miss are better, and it feels really good that the committee's actually recognized this. I wasn't sure that they would, but it seems they've kind of silenced Vol Nation. And they're going to have a tough time getting in unless the dice roll their way, with a lot of these teams getting upset in the top 12, which could happen. But they also have to play a really dicey Vanderbilt team. So you never know. But let's stop with the comparisons, man.
Absolutely. And the committee in past years, not really in favor of these Ole Miss Rebels, especially with the 14 playoff in recent years, when Ole Miss has kind of been on the brink a couple of those years of maybe being in the top 10 spot to push for a 14 playoff. But the committee is just not really in their favor in those years. But it seems like the committee likes where this Ole Miss team is at right now. It seems like the committee is kind of watching where this Ole Miss team is at defensively and offensively right now. Really defensively just the past couple of weeks. And it seems like that if you're an Ole Miss fan, or if you're a follower of this Ole Miss program, that you feel like you're in a pretty good spot at clinching a playoff spot if you win these next 2 games. That game against Florida will be 11 a.m. this coming up weekend on Saturday in Gainesville on ABC. If you can't make it to Gainesville, be sure to tune into that one and see what the Rebels can do and continue this hot streak they've been on both sides of the ball recently, especially on the defensive end. I think that's all we got for you guys to talk about playoffs right now. And with that, we'll jump into a little bit of recruiting talk. Devin Harper, inside offensive line, we talked about him in the last podcast, was on the brink of flipping from Ole Miss, from LSU to Ole Miss, and then following the LSU loss to Florida, pretty quickly after that LSU loss to Florida, Devin Harper flips his commitment to Ole Miss from LSU. Like I spoke about him last week, you watched the film. He's a very powerful run blocker. He's been playing left tackle out in Captain Shreve in Shreveport, Louisiana. Quick off the ball, and he's really good in his pass blocking at 6'4", 305. Number 3 player in the state of Louisiana, 7th interior offensive lineman in the country. This is a big pickup for Ole Miss, and to be able to take a big-time pickup like that away from a premier program like LSU is huge for the recruiting to come for this Ole Miss team.
Yeah, and I want to touch on this. I think Lane may have been playing a couple of games here. Quite honestly, I think Harper was committed for a little bit silently, and maybe Lane was waiting to see the result of this game because the timing was pretty strange. The second the LSU game ended, I checked my phone and it was on Hayes Fawcett. It was all over the social media, and that he flipped to Ole Miss. Regardless of the fact, this is an elite player, and it's really difficult to go into Louisiana and flip a kid committed to LSU. It's usually the opposite. Mississippi kids or kids who are from out Louisiana committed to Ole Miss end up flipping to LSU. So it's a new era at Ole Miss football here, guys, and it's really special that we're all getting to be a part of it. And we got to continue to recognize that this is a really good player here, has a chance to come in, probably play as a redshirt freshman, and really develop here as a sophomore and as a junior to potentially be an NFL player. He's got everything that you need. I will say offensive line hasn't been the best spot of high school recruiting for Ole Miss. So it definitely looks great for John Garrison to go out and get a guy like this. And it goes to show that winning actually does solve a lot of your problems, Cam.
Absolutely. And I think just like you said, Ole Miss hasn't really got that big time offensive lineman prospect in recent years. And really, off the top of my head, I can't think of a really big time one since Laramie Tunsil that's came into this university and just made an impact immediately, being a 5-star, 4-star offensive lineman. And I think Devin Harper can be one of those guys for Ole Miss next year. This is the Ole Miss team that's going to lose a lot of that offensive line, a lot of seniors on that offensive line, I believe. Off the top of my head, I think only Jaden Williams and Diego Pounds and Micah Pettis are the only ones that could possibly return if they wanted to. Obviously, those guys don't have to return, but if Ole Miss can get those guys back, that would help out that offensive line depth because they're going to lose a lot of guys just to graduation next year and loss of eligibility. But that's a big time pickup for this Ole Miss team, and just moving forward for John Garrison if he can get more premier blue chip prospects like that on the offensive front and keep up with what Pete Golden is doing on the defensive side of the ball on that defensive line. It could really help this Ole Miss team in the future be a team like Alabama, Georgia, teams like that in the recruiting rankings, as well as keeping up with them on the field skill level wise. That moves me into my point with Jared Smith. Zach talked about him earlier this week when David Johnson of 247 Sports said that this is possible pretty close to a flip of commitment from Auburn to Ole Miss for Jared Smith, 25th player in the country, second-ranked edge player in the country, second-ranked player in the state of Alabama out of Thompson High School. Jared Smith is a guy that Zach says that he thinks is a Dylan Stewart type of impact guy. And if you look at the measurables, you watch the tape, it's definitely there. He's 6'6", 235. And this is another 5-star prospect that Pete Gold might get his hands on.
Pete's elite, man. And guys, if you didn't know this by now, I hope you're ready because Pete is not only building something really special through high school, but also in the transfer portal. And Jared Smith can kind of hit the nail on the head there. He's a guy who's going to come in like Dylan Stewart and can play immediately, whether it's here, South Carolina is slightly in the mix, or Auburn. And similar to Harper, you're going into Alabama and you're stealing a kid who's committed to one of the Alabama schools, the premier Alabama school, an SEC school there. And it really just, man, it's speaks volumes of Pete Golding and what he's done here. Again, I want to thank Alabama for that gift because they all hated him for some reason, and he's done nothing but be incredible since he's gotten here. According to 247 Sports, I was telling Cam this earlier, but this is a guy who's projected to be a first-round draft pick by the time he's done with college. So he's a day one player, an immediate impact, and someone you really want if you're Ole Miss because you're going to lose unfortunately, almost everyone on the defensive line, similar to the offensive line and a lot of the rest of the team. So you want to fill those holes with both portal guys and high school guys, and Jared Smith would be a great start to do that.
Absolutely. If Ole Miss can land Smith, that would just be another gem of a prospect that they've landed in this recruiting class. It seems like it's just getting better and better by the week as Ole Miss gets hot late in these games, and I guess in quoting Tim Elko there. I believe that's all we got for you guys for football and recruiting. So that will leave us to end this podcast with a little bit of just small talk on basketball and what's been going on. I know a lot of people have been stuck on football and just waiting to see what these Rebels are going to do to end the year. But the Lady Rebels for Coach Yo and Coach Beard's guys on the men's basketball side, they've been playing some pretty good basketball as of recently. Going to hop into some women's basketball right now. I believe last time we left you guys off, we were talking about Ole Miss heading to Delaware to take on Delaware State. They ended up winning that game 80-42. This was a game that Delaware State kind of jumped out in front of Ole Miss a little bit, or at least kind of held them defensively for a while. Kind of maybe looked like Ole Miss was maybe just missing a lot of shots early in this game. It seemed like a lot of the shots early in the game were just not falling. A lot of open shots, a lot of open looks, like fast break layups that just weren't falling for this Ole Miss team. Just kind of all sorts out of sorts and all over the place to start this game. But really in the second half, this team settled in. Star Jacobs had her best game yet, 18.6 rebounds. Kennedy Todd Williams continues to be an elite playmaker, 13 points, 5 assists, 9 rebounds. This is an Ole Miss team that I believe is one of the best defending teams in the country. I think they're fifth or sixth in the SEC in points allowed per game right now. I think they're forcing at least 20 turnovers a game right now, which is really outstanding for this Ole Miss team, who's just kind of swarming the ball on defense for Coach Yo. And this is a Coach Yo team that we've seen in the past be a really good defending team, but looking at this team this year, it seems like everyone has really good experience with each other, playing with each other. Having KK Dean's back really gives this team an edge. And sometimes even have her coming off the bench and Sierra Chano starting. And Sierra Chano, I'll talk a little bit about her in this next one. Moving into Jackson State, had a great game in that one. But like I mentioned in the last podcast, Sierra Chano has been a great freshman, really impact freshman for this Ole Miss team. Maybe not to the standard that we've seen Juju Watkins do last year, but this is a freshman that I believe could make an All-SEC team at some point to close the year.
Yeah, and this is a really great job by Coach Yo. She's kind of assembled a group that looks really connected early in the year, and they're handling these non-cons like they should be. And it's ultimately going to prepare them for when SEC play rolls around. And we saw that the talent, the first game of the year, they really should have beaten USC. So the potential's there. It's just kind of tying those loose ends together during non-con. And it looks like they're doing that. I think, the leadership's been great by Maddie Scott and all the older ladies on the team. They're doing a fantastic job. But ultimately, keeping these games far from reach always looks great on the schedule, helps the resume as well. It's going to prepare these girls for conference play. So big things for women's basketball. It's going to be a really good finish to the year, despite just being in November.
Absolutely. They won that game against Delaware State 80-42. They just won on Monday and went up in the rankings, I guess, either during that game or right after that game from 19th to 17th, beating Jackson State 76-44 on Kids Day. The pavilion was packed full of kids all around from Oxford and the surrounding areas. Very loud in there. If you watch the highlights of that game, if you go back, you can just hear how loud those kids were in that stadium that day. It's crazy. I'm pretty sure Coach Yo and the rest of those Rebels loved that game. Like I mentioned, Sierra Chano had 16 points in that game. Her career has so far. She only missed one shot. This is an Ole Miss team that's really struggling from the three-point line right now and from the free throw line, but really just getting points where they can find them. And a lot of those points have been coming from the paint from this Ole Miss team, who seem to be out-rebounding every opponent that they played to this point, and they're just being more physical than their opponents, especially down the stretch. We're just wearing teams down in the second half. If you don't have depth against this Ole Miss team, this is an Ole Miss team that Coach Yo is going to run 10 players to 11 players out there every game. And it's wearing teams down early in the season. I'm sure she's going to try to continue to do that in SEC play as long as her bench continues to perform the way it has right now. I believe that's all we got for women's basketball. Women's basketball will hit the road next to the Bahamas for the Bahamas tournament that Coach Yo has had this team participating in every year. They'll be playing Boston College at 4 p.m. I believe that'll be on November 25th at 4 p.m. in the Bahamas. Be sure to tune into that one and watch Coach Yo and Team 50 play Boston College. With that, I'll move into men's basketball. They played in Landers Center in South Haven in a neutral site, as I mentioned last week to Zach. Not really a neutral site. I believe this is maybe the fifth or sixth time that Ole Miss has played in the Landers Center. Hasn't been played in a long time there. Not really sure why Colorado State agreed to this neutral site, but coming out of this game, it seemed like Ole Miss was going to run away with it. I think they had a 21-7 lead early in this game. It seemed like they weren't missing shots, which was good to see because this Ole Miss team was struggling to get shots going early in games in the past couple of games, especially the past 2 to 3 for this Ole Miss team. But really early in the game, it seemed like this team was getting shots to fall. Dre Davis, Matthew Morrell, Malik D were all getting shots to fall early in this game. And it continues to be Juju Murray just emerging for this team, whether it's late in the game or middle of the game, but seems to be late in the game as of recently. Juju Murray is just kind of just cruised along the rest of the whole game, throwing assists out to other guys, getting his the offense going, and then late in the game just taking over. I believe it was about midway through the second half, Juju Murray pulled up from 3, and from there he just kind of lit the rest of the stat sheet up. I think he had 8 of his points in the second half, and kind of just pulled away from that Colorado State team that was kind of fighting in the second half. It seemed like when the second half started, this Colorado State Rams team seemed like they had a little bit of edge to them, but this Ole Miss team continues to be very physical and playing great defense right now for Coach Beard.
Yeah, this one being a neutral site is awesome. It looks really good on the resume. It's going to look really good when March comes around. And I really want to credit the team for, relaxing with the personal fouls. McKeel Brown-Jones has been a guy who's had to get pulled out in almost every game that I've watched because of the fouling. Malik Dia as well, and both of them were held to 2 and a team total of 15 personal fouls. So credit to Chris Beard for really working on that. Cam mentioned it, but Juju Murray is a stud. Just a leader on this team, a guy who's going to continue to generate the offense even when it looks like there's not much going on. He's the guy you force up a 3 and odds are it's probably going to go in. He has that swagger. He's from the Bronx. He's everything you want to be a leader on this team, and he's done an electric job. Sean Padula continues to just be the ultimate role player. He's going to have those games like he did in the Tad Pad where he scores 25 plus, and then he's going to have games like Saturday. He plays 36 minutes. 36 minutes. The guy is always on the floor. 4 rebounds, 2 assists, 9 points. That's all you need to win, right? So Sean's doing an awesome job. Credit to him. He was the perfect addition that this team really needed at point guard. And it goes to show that this team is good enough to play up to solid competition. I think what they need to work on moving forward is playing at that standard against teams who aren't as great, and they're going to have the chance to do that against Oral Roberts here on Thursday night.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned Sean Padula's play in that one, 36 minutes in that one, only 9 points, 4 rebounds, 2 assists. But it seems like Chris Beard's got himself another player like Matthew Morrell. Only with Sean Padula, this guy plays point guard and handles the ball pretty much the majority of the game. Matthew Morrell is kind of the off-the-ball player, just athletic guy, and he gets shots up, going to hustle the whole game. And it seems like you got 2 guys like that now in Padula and Morrell. Obviously, Morrell coming off of an injury, sitting out that Tad Pad game. Played 32 minutes still in that game against Colorado State, and I believe that's what you're going to see most of the year. You're probably going to see Padula and Morrell probably play 35-plus minutes every game, and then every other guy just rotating in. Really like how Zach said, McKeel Brown-Jones staying out of foul trouble in this game. He had 14 points for Ole Miss and seemed like the majority of the offense in that first half of this Ole Miss team. Saw the big man really moving around really well in the paint, getting a chance to really show his offensive end. And really, I think the biggest thing is, and we've talked about it before the year, we talked about it as the year went on, McKeel Brown-Jones is a very, very physical player, and he shows it week in and week out. And a guy like McKeel Brown-Jones and a guy with the size of Malik D at 6'9", 250, this is what you're going to need in SEC play. And these guys can stay out of foul trouble and stay on the floor. This Ole Miss team is going to be in really good shape. Ole Miss fell out of the rankings. They were 25th. In that game against Colorado State on Monday. They fell out of the rankings, and I think they had the second most votes out of the teams outside of the rankings. So if you're being technical, that puts them at 27th. The good news is, if you're looking at any good news falling out of those rankings, is Illinois bumped up to 25th in those rankings. As you guys know, Ole Miss put a beating on Illinois in that scrimmage game a couple weeks ago before the season began. So it gives you an idea of a team in front of you now that you can beat. This is a team that for Ole Miss that you have a lot of talent on and a lot of good defensive play and veteran players now. Moving forward for this Ole Miss team, you just got to try to win the rest of the conference games like you did last year and see where you're at heading into SEC play. And the SEC for basketball this year, just like pretty much every other sport, is going to be a gauntlet.
Yeah, and similar to the women's, these are the games and you have to take advantage of. You got to really sort these things out, and I didn't think the Ole Miss was really doing that. You look at that Grambling State game; it was a lot closer than it needed to be. Yeah, Grambling is a good squad, but then they go to Gainesville to play Florida and they lose by 20 plus a couple days later. So Ole Miss, it feels like they're turning up a little bit. I mentioned the foul thing, which is massive because it allows those versatile guys like Cam talked about, MBJ and Malik Dia to really stay in the game and be the big men that this team needs. So if they're in, Sean Padula and Matt Morrell are playing their game. Sky's the limit for this team. Just keep it simple, make your shots, play good, crispier defense, and you can compete with anyone in the SEC. But it's important that you get the team in SEC shape and SEC condition by the time that rolls around here. I believe in December. I want to say, Cam, maybe January.
Yeah. And I believe that's all we got for you guys today for basketball and for the rest of the pod. We'll probably get back with you guys to preview a little bit about Florida matchup later this week. Obviously, that game for Ole Miss versus Florida will be 11 a.m. on ABC in Gainesville in the Swamp. Ole Miss has a pretty good record in the Swamp in recent years. My last memory of Ole Miss playing in the Swamp was a blowout victory for the Gators back when Chad Kelly was the quarterback of Ole Miss. So hopefully Ole Miss can go ahead and wipe that memory away from my brain and get a win in Gainesville on Saturday coming up this weekend. Obviously, for basketball, we just spoke about it. The women's will be in the Bahamas on the 25th of November at 4 p.m. against Boston College. First game of that tournament. If they win, they will advance against another team in that tournament. Not really sure off the top of my head other teams in that tournament. And the men's basketball team will play Oral Roberts this coming Thursday at 7 p.m. in the Pavilion. So be sure to pack the Pavilion for that one for Coach Beard and the Rebels men's basketball team. That's all we got for you guys for this week. And be sure to tune into the rebelwalk.com for all your Ole Miss sports.